Ladies and gentlemen, this is Russell Roberts. I worked with Russell about 40, 45 years ago. Yeah, you can see the smile. And it's kind of wild how an offhand comment can change somebody's life. And Russell, you don't know this, but you changed my life. And what happened was that Russell, I think it would be accurate to say you were a libertarian before there was a Libertarian Party. And Russell, Ted Kennedy was passing laws to make life, Jim, for oil companies really, really difficult. And the anger in Russell's voice so grabbed me, and his logic about Ted Kennedy never drew a drop of oil out of the ground, it affected me, Russell. I don't know if you remember that conversation. Probably not. But it was that 30-second basic anger that drove me, in part, I had been also something of a libertarian before that, to become a libertarian. So thank you, Russell, for pushing me in God's direction. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is, again, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. It's especially important today because I have to turn on the microphone for Russell to hear us. If I don't mute the microphone, we get a terrible echo on the recording, and I don't want that. So, without further ado, I did want everybody to know the video that was playing on the screen earlier, the rap video on not Russell versus Hayek, on Hayek versus Keynes, has 5.5 million views, has been translated into 11 languages. It is just a great honor to have this man take his time to talk to us. And I'm going to let him describe what he will be talking to us. And I am now muting my mic. And with that, Russell, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Ralph. Yeah, I think we first met in 1976, which is a very, very long time ago, about 40 years. So that's kind of mind-blowing. And can everybody hear me okay? Can you just wave if you can hear me fine? Good. Appreciate that. I also want to mention there's a second Keynes Hayek rap video called Fight of the Century. So if you like the first one, please enjoy the second one as well. So I'm going to talk today about empirical work, about the use of statistics and data to answer economic questions, and raise some of the problems that I have with the application of those statistical techniques to economic policy, which is a little ironic because Ralph and I worked on that together 40 years ago, which just the way the world is. It's just everything that goes around comes around, I guess. I would also add, I may say some things in passing about encouraging people to become libertarian. And I'm somewhat chagrined, Ralph, that anger played a role in my impact on you, because one of my themes today is going to be that anger is not usually productive, but I guess it's not always unproductive. So we'll talk about that. So I want to start with an example, which is the minimum wage. It's an issue that's almost always in the news, and you might think about that point, why it's almost always in the news. Why is it that there's always stories about how we ought to raise the minimum wage and we need to raise the minimum wage and this city or that state is thinking of raising the minimum wage, this presidential candidate, and in this year, unfortunately, I think it's probably two presidential candidates of the two major parties or both have said positive things about raising the minimum wage. And I'm against it, and I assume most of you are. If I could again see a show of hands, how many people that I can see are against raising the minimum wage? How many people would like to see it abolished completely? So that would be me. So the question is, when you're arguing with your neighbor, your cousin, your uncle from Topeka, your aunt from Peoria, what arguments do you use, and what arguments should you use when you make the case against the minimum wage? And if I asked you to write them down right now, we won't do that, but if I asked you to write them down, what would be the arguments that you would give? In fact, Ralph, is it possible for you to just go around and let people list some reasons for why the minimum wage is a bad thing?
If you do not talk, Russell, people will be able to talk without an echo. Who wishes to address the issue about why the minimum wage is a terrible thing? Sir, I forgot your name. Scott. Oh!
Okay, you can hear me? Looking at the fundamentals, there's very few fundamental things in economics that hold true throughout. And one of them is that wage and price controls always result in market distortions, shortages, and black markets. It's not an issue of what the minimum wage should be, it's that it's being controlled. And that's what the problem is.
John Caldera, with the Anti-Freedom, you're not allowed to hire your next door neighbor to take care of your kids at whatever price you agree on, because it's against the law. So minimum wage is a basic abuse of the ability of people to work together.
It's just unfair, regardless of the economics of it, somebody gets penalized. Somebody who has more expertise and it's more valuable to a company, they have to get penalized in order for the people with the lowest wage to be paid minimum wage. So I just find it unethical, and a small percentage, I don't know exactly what it is, but I heard that a very small percentage of people actually work for minimum wage, so it doesn't make much of a difference anyway. So the argument to use it politically without telling us how many people actually work for minimum wage doesn't make sense.
Violates two things. The moral argument, moral dimension, is it violates the right of contract and or the right of free association. The economic argument is it hurts the people the worst who it's intended to help.
Okay. So I made my own list. Can everybody hear me again? Raise your hand. Can you hear me? Good. So I made my own list, some of which are reasons you gave, and I'm going to add some ones you sometimes hear. It causes inflation. It's morally wrong. It's bad for business. It's bad for the economy. Sometimes you hear it's, quote, inefficient, which is an economics piece of economics jargon. It's not the everyday use of the word inefficient. In economics, inefficient means it makes the pie of economic production smaller than it otherwise would be. And then the final reason that I would give is the one that was just given by the last gentleman, which is it hurts the people that it's trying to help. Now, I want you to think about those different reasons and think about the fact that some of those reasons you would give in this forum, talking among friends who are similarly philosophically like-minded. But what if you were talking to people who didn't agree with you? What would be the best argument to use in that case? And I would suggest that for most people who favor the minimum wage, many of the arguments you made wouldn't dent them at all. It wouldn't speak to them. They don't share your respect for the law of contract. Their sense of equality and fairness is not the same as yours. And they would not find any of those arguments persuasive. In fact, the only one I think that is persuasive, and I think it's the correct reason, may not be the reason that you and I feel the way we do, but the best reason for arguing against it with people who don't agree with us is the last one, which is it hurts the people it's trying to help. Now, let's say you want to make the case for that. How would you do that? How would you make that case? Now, there are two ways to make it. One is going to be via first principles, which I'll do in a minute. But the standard way, the way most people make the argument in the public debate, is with empirical work. It's with evidence. It's with facts. But it's not just normal facts. It's basically statistical analysis of a sophisticated kind. And the reason it has to be that way is that otherwise you really don't have a leg to stand on. So if I, for example, say the states with the highest minimum wage are the states that have the most jobs, and therefore the minimum wage doesn't hurt jobs, doesn't hurt the employment possibilities of low-skilled people, that's not a very good argument. the other side often makes. You will hear it. You will hear people say states with high minimum wages have lots of jobs, so therefore the minimum wage doesn't hurt employment. What's wrong with that argument? And the answer is, well, because you haven't control for the other things. It's not the case that states that have high minimum wage, that the only thing different between those states and states with a low minimum wage is the minimum wage. They have 1,000, a million other things going on at the same time. So statistically, we'd like to be able to control for those differences, and that's what statistics, sometimes called econometrics, tries to do. It tries to isolate the independent effect of the minimum wage, quote, holding everything else constant, all the other differences that might explain why there are more jobs or fewer jobs in one place and then in the other. Before I go on, I want to just add that this debate's particularly sterile because it has focused inevitably and inexorably on jobs. Jobs are incredibly important, but of course that's not the only aspect of the labor market that you would care about if you were a low-skill worker trying to advance your career and be prosperous. There's also the way you're treated at work, the investments your employer makes in you, your opportunities to advance. So having a job is not the only thing you care about. It's really important, but it's not the only thing you care about. And one of the things that's horrible to me about the minimum wage is it basically creates excess supply of workers relative to the number of people who want to hire them. And that makes it a lot easier for employers to treat their employees poorly. They don't have any incentive to invest in them anymore. They don't have an incentive to be nice to them. They don't have an incentive to treat them graciously. So there are a lot of aspects of work that are outside of employment, but inevitably the debate takes place on employment. So the question is, how would you go about trying to measure that? Can you measure the independent effect of the minimum wage on employment? And you can start to see the nature of the problem when you think about what one of you said. It's a very small proportion of the total workforce. So if I ask people, when I ask people, and I often do, what proportion of the American workforce earns the minimum wage or less, the standard answer, inevitably, the median answer is 20%, which is shockingly wrong by a large amount. The actual answer is about 2.5%. So that 20% answer is off by a factor of 10. Factor of 10, not 10%, 10 times too high. Now, if only 2.5% of the workforce earns the minimum wage or less, now you have to try to measure the impact of a change, say, in the minimum wage on that very small group. But of course, there's a lot of other things happening to all the other workers that are affecting that group too, and a lot of things going on in the economy. And so it's very hard to isolate the effect of the minimum wage, which means that as a result, unfortunately, it's very easy to find results that show that the minimum wage has little or no effect, and it's easy to find results that show the minimum wage has a huge effect. And so then the question is, which one's right? And if you're like me, growing up as a professional economist until recently, the way I looked at that debate was, well, my side has the good studies, and the other side has the bad studies. So my guys, they do the good studies. They're the ones we can trust. The other side studies, they're awful. They make bad assumptions. They're unrealistic. They're not reliable. They can't be replicated. And then I started to realize at some point that the other side feels the same way about me. They think my side does bad research. They think my side has bad economics. They think my side has bad estimates and bad econometrics and bad statistics. And strangely enough, it's hard to believe, but they're actually nice people on the other side. They just don't agree with me. So then what am I to do? What should my conclusion be if on this issue, and it lines up very ideologically, people who want the government to be more involved in the economy tend to believe that the minimum wage has a relatively small effect on employment. And those of us who tend to be libertarian, we often agree with the results that show that it has a very big effect on the workers it's trying to help. It actually hurts employment of low-skilled workers, and so it's counterproductive. And then you start looking at other issues, and you realize, well, this problem is kind of a consistently bad problem all across the board. So if you ask, did the stimulus create jobs, President Obama's stimulus package of 2009, there's a whole bunch of left-leaning economists who think it was a great program, it saved the country, it saved the world, et cetera. And there's another group of people who think it didn't work at all, or it was actually counterproductive. They tend to be people who are free market oriented, who are more like me. And people yell at each other. And how do they yell at each other? Well, they yell at each other. The sticks they use to hit each other with while they're yelling are the econometrics and the statistics. But we don't really create a lot of light. There's not a lot of truth being generated. Just really what Hayek called scientism. Things that look scientific, but in fact, they have the language of science because they've got Greek letters. They have the language of science because they have terms like standard deviation and standard errors and statistical significance. But in terms of reliability and credibility, they really aren't much better than just saying, I think the minimum wage is a bad idea and here's why. So when I started to realize that, it really changed the way I looked at my field and also the way that I looked at econometrics and evidence. So just to give one more example relative to the stimulus, which is kind of shocking, really horrifying. If you ask many economists, and certainly pundits, people who aren't trained as economists, people who are in the business of trying to write about public policy, they'll often say that we know that the stimulus package created millions of jobs because the Congressional Budget Office did all these studies, and they're bipartisan. They're objective. They found that the stimulus created, say, 2.3 or 3.2 or 4.6 million jobs. And if you go and look at the CBO studies, which is pretty amazing, most of the people who write about it don't bother to look at the studies. If you actually go back and look at the studies, it's literally hard to believe. You cannot imagine that this is what the Congressional Budget Office actually did. So here's what they actually did to get those numbers. It's quite extraordinary. What they did is, before the stimulus was passed, they looked at previous government expenditure, and they tried to find the correlation between government expenditure and jobs created under different situations. And now, of course, this one is unique. It's a particularly unusual mix of financial crisis and other obviously manyfold differences between past recessions and government spending. But they made some estimate of the multiplier, and they predicted, based on that past statistical analysis, how many jobs would be created by the stimulus package. And then after the package passed and a year went by or 6 months went by, they wanted to find out what actually happened. So what did they do? They took the same model that had predicted how many jobs would be created, and instead of putting in the amount that was expected to be spent, they put in the amount that was actually spent. But they didn't look at what actually happened to the number of jobs. And they have a footnote, as if this is just like a little aside, but of course it's the whole thing. The footnote says, now you might think that we should have looked at what actually happened in the economy after the stimulus passed. And they said, but that would have required us to estimate what would have happened if the stimulus hadn't passed. And since that's really hard to do, we just use the old model. But that's nonsense. That's literally nonsensical. That makes no sense whatsoever. They're saying we can't really hold everything else constant, so we're going to use the lousy measure we estimated before it actually happened as the basis for measuring what did happen when, in fact, we didn't do that. That is, they did not look at the actual data on job creation in the aftermath of the stimulus. They just made up a number based on their old estimates of the relationship between government spending and jobs. So that's the way the world works. It's kind of extraordinary, and you don't always that doesn't always get focused on, but that's what actually happened. Now, the real problem with this, so one problem is what you might call ideological bias, that people tend to use numbers and studies and data that confirm their political and ideological bias. That would include me. We all have this problem. The other bias, of course, is what might be called publication bias. If I do a study and I can't publish it, it's not so good for my career. So I tend to be encouraged to find things that are dramatic, that are counterintuitive. And if you pay attention, and it's something I pay attention to because I'm deeply interested in this issue, you'll notice that this issue of the reliability of statistical findings is a problem in all fields right now, not just economics. So in psychology, a major study, this is an amazing thing that it was done at all, but a major study was launched by Brian Nosek at the University of Virginia and others, looking at how many of results in psychology, experimental results, were more than just a one-time curiosity. Could they be replicated? Would they stand up? Would they be found to have the same impact again, these results? And it turned out, in the way they defined it, course, there's always some ambiguity, about 39% of the findings of the last 10 years of the premier journal of psychology could be replicated, which means that 61% were not true, or at least weren't true then, or weren't true anymore, or couldn't be found to be true. It's a huge problem in epidemiology and medicine, which is slightly more important than psychology. So it's one thing to say, well, if you talk slowly and if you mention old age and seniors and retirement in a conversation, that the people will leave the room walking more slowly. That's a serious, hugely influential finding in the psychology literature, that if you invoke terms that remind people that they might be elderly or be elderly soon, they walk more slowly when they leave the experiment than when you don't. I laugh about it because it seems like a ludicrous idea to me. That did not replicate. They could not find that again when they tried to do it again. That finding did not replicate. But, that's not really so important. But whether caffeine causes cancer, that would be important, or broccoli. And, of course, there's an unbelievable number of studies in epidemiology and medicine that find the harmful or healthy effects of this diet or this food or this amount of exercise, this kind of exercise. Makes the front page of the New York Times. Drink wine, don't drink wine, gives you a heart attack, reduces your risk of heart attack. What do we know? What's true? What's reliable? And the answer is not as much as it appears to be. And so I find that really important. It's a huge problem in medicine, in particular in medicine. I had a guest on Econ Talk, Adam Cifu, C-I-F-U, of the University of Chicago. And he and his co-author had done a study they looked at an enormous number of studies that found relationships between treatment X and some result. So some diagnostic device, some diagnostic tool, some protocol of medical health, chemotherapy, whatever it is, and then they'd look and see whether people had longer survival rates. And oftentimes there would be a empirical analysis like the ones we've been talking about, where people tried to hold a bunch of stuff constant and isolate the effect of the variable, whether it was drinking wine or getting cement put in your back for back pain or various other similar things. And they'd find some positive result, and that diagnostic technique or that protocol or that therapy would be put in place. And then they do a double-blind control experiment where half the group would get the therapy and half the group wouldn't. And the results that had shown up in the statistical analysis wouldn't show up in the double-blind, in the randomized controlled version of it. And so a lot of the things that people would do for 5 or 10 years turned out not so good for you. And so this is a hugely important issue. It's important in medicine. It's important in psychology. Obviously, it's important in trying to figure out what's going on with our climate. It's very important in economic policy. We're changing legislation. We're changing legislation that affects millions of people based on evidence that's not really evidence. It's not reliable. So when I look at that fact, which I think is a fact, you have to ask, where does that leave us as economists? What should our role be? What is the usefulness of economics? And I would suggest that it should make us more humble. We should be less confident about the empirical magnitudes of the stuff we're talking about. And if you ask me, why am I against the minimum wage, which I am, I don't say any longer, well, there's a bunch of studies that show the minimum wage destroys jobs. And then the other person might say, yeah, but there are a bunch of studies that show that the minimum wage doesn't destroy jobs. And my answer to that now is, yeah, it's really hard to measure that. So I don't really rely on that. And I don't want to pretend that I'm more scientific than you or my studies are better than your studies. Because a lot of times very hard to determine whose studies are good and whose studies aren't. So instead, I'm more honest about why I'm against the minimum wage. I'm against the minimum wage because there's a lot of evidence. It's not statistical. It's not fancy. There's a lot of evidence that firms respond to incentives and reduce employment when their costs go up. That's why they move factories overseas. It's to find inexpensive labor. Most people understand that. Most people on left, right, and center agree that when wages are low in one place, there's an incentive to try to use those workers if their productivity is sufficiently high as a company or as a factory. So why is it then that if I raise the minimum wage artificially, that firms aren't going to respond by using more technology or trying to find other ways to respond to that increase? So I'm more likely to invoke a general principle, but not some fancy econometric study. And I would say in closing that in general, I rely more on economic principles and fundamentals, but I have to be honest that it doesn't prove anything. The things that we believe in are not like science. I think the things we believe in that are like science are things like incentives matter and that costs are real, include time and not just money. And what I think the real value of economics is not in trying to measure the impact down to the third decimal point of the minimum wage or the stimulus package or something like that. The real value of economics is to help us organize our thinking. It's an incredibly powerful tool, but it doesn't give us answers to many of the questions that politicians and the public want. And so what do? We make them up. We pretend we know the answer. We're overconfident. And I think that's dangerous, degrading to economics, and fundamentally dishonest. I'm going to stop there. I'll open it up for questions. You can ask me about anything you want. You can ask me about anything in the news. You can ask me about any of my work that you may be aware of. And you can ask about anything I just said. So thanks for listening, and let me know what you want to talk about.
Russell, please do not speak for a moment, okay? Thank you. Who wishes to speak? And I've got a list of things I want to talk about, as usual. So let's start with Bill. And Bill, please take that. Hold on 1 second, Bill.
Hello, hello. Hello, hello. Really? Okay, I'm talking into the phone. Okay, well, I had a little anecdote. I was working for minimum wage at $1.40 an hour for a construction company on the border in El Paso. And the minimum wage went to $1.60. 3 people got laid off, and they bought a new truck. And it was just immediate with the minimum wage. So ever since then, I've remembered that, my personal experience. You want to have somebody else talk?
Russell, did you hear the question? Okay. Or you want to comment on that substitution effect?
I want to thank you for your refreshing honesty when it comes to talking about the statistics and the meaning. And I have a degree in applied math, and I think the math doesn't mean anything if you don't use common sense. I mean, there's so much going on that people do. I'd be curious, I wrote some names down that you mentioned. I'd be curious to do more of my own research on statistics that are meaningless. Like you mentioned some things, and you mentioned Adam Sifu, I think, from University of Chicago, that he wrote along. Do you have any other, or do you have any of your papers, or I don't know if I could contact you by email, so I just want to have some starting points where I can show people that statistics can with specific.
So I have a weekly podcast, Econ Talk, where I interview economists, authors, anyone who's interesting to me, vaguely related to economics. Some of them are mainstream economic topics such as monetary theory or the financial crisis, but a lot of them aren't. This week's episode comes out every Monday morning. Anybody there, by the way, listen to Econ Talk? Raise your hand if you do. So I recommend it, obviously. There's no charge. You can find it on iTunes. You can get it on your iPhone or listen to it on SoundCloud or other ways to access it. But 2 of the people I'd recommend are I interviewed Adam Sifu about his book. Cifu is his last name, Adam Sifu. And that book is, I think it's called Medical Reversal, but that's what the book's about. I don't remember. I think that's the title. Another interesting author on this question who I've interviewed is Brian Nozick, who I mentioned, who's been in charge of this massive attempt to replicate works in psychology. And then finally, 2 weeks ago, I interviewed Chuck Klosterman talking about But What If We're Wrong, which is a sort of humility-inducing look at all the times that people have been wrong in the past. And not so much about facts and theories. I can't really explain the book other than to say it's one of the most interesting books I've read in a long time. And those books Another name I'd mention is Nassim Taleb, Taleb. His book, Fooled by Randomness, is a wonderful book on how to misinterpret statistics and how commonly people misinterpret statistics. And I didn't respond to Bill because Bill didn't ask a question. He told an anecdote, which I appreciated. And I think you have to be careful with anecdotes, but they do help you remember sometimes some basic fundamental economics. They don't prove anything, but they do grab your attention. You have to they do help you sometimes. Next question.
Anybody here who wants to ask a question? You had a comment that Russell didn't hear because the mic was muted. Your mic is now muted. Let me turn it on.
Oh, I think Ralph is saying, I said at the beginning, I thanked you for your refreshing honesty about the statistic not working. I wasn't sure if you heard that comment.
I did. Thank you.
Okay, so anybody else? Oh, Jerry, so please, this microphone was specifically delivered for you. Hold on one second.
Okay. Can you speak to the fact that smoke alarms or seat belts are going to be paid for by insurance, and that here's an institution that will do the grand statistics and come up with incentives to use them?
So those are cases where the use of the statistics is much more straightforward than it might be in other situations, or the causal relationship is more straightforward. So one example related to this would be baseball. So baseball has been, and I'm getting some of this from a new book I'm reading by Catherine, I think it's Kathy O'Neill. I'm interviewing her actually tomorrow for Econ Talk. But she makes the point that the use of statistics in baseball, it works pretty well because it's very clear how you're successful in baseball. You got to score more runs than the other team, then you win. If you don't, you lose. It's pretty clear. Then you have to have a model of what does it take to score more runs? And of course, that's a little more complicated, but it's not that much more complicated. It's pretty clear that a double's worth more than a single, triple's more than a double, home run's more than a triple. Where it gets interesting is a question like, well, what if you bunt? And if you bunt to advance a runner, or if you steal a base, there's a good thing that happens. We know exactly what that good thing is. You get an extra base. There's a chance you'll get more than that if you bunt because that might be a wild throw in response to the bunt. But there's a chance that you'll make it out. Most of the time you will make it out. So there's a trade-off, and you have to measure the impact of that trade-off on whether you increases your chances of winning or whether it doesn't. And we have pretty good ways of measuring that trade-off. And in particular, you can do simulations, you can look at statistics, and it works pretty well. So I would say the same thing about seatbelts. In seatbelts, we know there's a trade-off. If you wear a seatbelt, you're more likely to be saved in an accident. There's a chance, God forbid, you'll go over a bridge and you'll be stuck in a car and you'll have trouble getting out of the car because you're wearing a seatbelt. We know the costs of time are what they are in terms of putting it on. It's relatively small. So that universe is pretty clear. But if I then move to the minimum wage, I don't have those kind of simple statistical techniques. So it's not surprising to me that insurance companies can say, if you wear your seatbelt, we're going to save money. So we will reward you for wearing your seatbelt. And I don't know how they enforce that. That's kind of a strange thing. I'm not sure how really important that is. Same thing with the smoke alarm. I have a smoke alarm. Is the battery up to date? I'm pretty sure it is. But, those are small things where the use of statistics is pretty easy to measure and where the benefits to the insurance company are pretty clear relative to the costs, and they're happy to incentivize you to do those things. It's a lot more complicated when I ask you, should you be eating what you're eating right now? I don't like the food content. I don't think it's good for you because you're going to end up on certain Medicare costs and blah, blah, blah. Boy, that's really complicated. We don't really have a very good idea of what you're putting in your mouth right now, the implication for your lifespan. There's some vague ideas that are often wrong. So isolating, we don't understand the biology. again, we understand how a seatbelt restrains you from being thrown through a glass windshield. We don't really know whether eating fat, as some of you surely are right now, whether that increases your lifespan or decreases it. We don't understand the causal mechanism even at the biological level, let alone whether there's a trade-off worth exploiting if we were to, say, ban it or tax it. Next question.
And Bill, go ahead. Turn on the.
I speak into the fuzzy end. All right, the quick question is, do you get to play around or walk up and down inside of Hoover Tower? I saw the Hoover Institution. I was quite impressed. I always loved the tower, but I never got into the Hoover Institution buildings out there. The real question is, I went to my doctor and he suggested 4 vaccines, and I went out to try to research whether the vaccine was effective and whether it was safe. And one of the vaccines was a pneumonia 23 valence polysaccharide vaccine, and I studied and I studied and I found this big meta study that said the conclusion was that after looking at all these other studies that claimed they were effective, that the polysaccharide based vaccine showed no measurable difference. So the 23 valence thing was, I didn't really get to the question of safety because as far as this report was, it was ineffective. And I know if you're in California, I don't know that you are, but you might be. And all the now with the compulsory vaccine things out there, I'd like to get, if you're involved at all in the vaccine, after you answer the question about the Hoover Tower.
Sure. So, first on the Hoover Tower, I live in Maryland, actually, outside Washington, D.C. I spend my summers out at the Hoover Institution in California. I work out of the D.C. office when I'm here in Maryland. As it turns out, last summer, which is, I guess we're still in the middle of it, but when I was in California maybe 3 weeks ago, I did go up in the tower with my daughter and her boyfriend. So I get it free of charge. It's one of the huge perks of being a Stanford employee. I don't think you have to be a Hoover fellow, but I think you save $2.50 or $3. It's really exhilarating. More important than the tower is the archives. And again, to plug my podcast, Econ Talk, coming out in a few weeks will be an interview with the head of the Hoover Archives, Eric Macon. And the Hoover Archives is one of the world's premier collections of material on communism. It has Milton Friedman's collected papers. We have, I think, the world's maybe one of the if not the largest collections of posters, all related to war, recruiting, propaganda. We have 133,000 posters. We have an X-ray of Hitler's skull, which not many people have. There are only about 5 of them, I think, in the world. We have the bombing order for the Enola Gay that was on the bulletin board that morning. And so what his job is and what the Hoover Archives are used for is very interesting. So you might want to listen to that. But to get to your second question about vaccines, I'm not involved in that, but I am fascinated by the ease with which doctors recommend various preventive techniques, preventive therapies, and palliative therapies, supposedly curative therapies, that where the evidence is weak or negative, actually. And I think every person should take their own medical care into hand in some sense. You're not an expert, but it is useful to be aware that to most doctors, they have a hammer, and when they see a nail, they want to hammer it. So they're always, strangely enough, more enthusiastic about their therapy that's their specialty than you might be. So I'm always just take it with a grain of salt. Doesn't mean they're wrong. They could be right. Those vaccines could be a good idea, but it's always good to do a little research. And it's more importantly, it's good to learn how to do a little research. Do some research on doing research so that you can explore these questions thoughtfully rather than just go into some crazy blog that says vaccines cause autism, which I don't think they do. But that doesn't mean that all vaccines are therefore a good idea. Some of them have side effects or are not effective, as you point out. The example that we've talked about a number of times on my podcast is various tests such as the PSA for prostate cancer or mammograms for women for breast cancer. And the data on the value of those tests is shockingly complex and not straightforward at all. So I'm not a doctor. I'm not going to give you medical advice, but I encourage you to listen to Econ Talk, and I encourage you to read the data and make your own decision, because there are trade-offs. It's not black and white. Next question.
Go ahead, Lee.
Okay. You may be aware that the Austrian school is criticized for not being fundamentally empiricist-based, but rather what I would call axiomatic-based, which makes it more similar to pure mathematics than science, where you would use the scientific method of looking at evidence or looking through evidence with the idea of trying to pull out some sort of law or relationship, but you start with the evidence. An axiomatic reasoning system starts with axioms from which you derive true statements, and I think the Austrian school is more akin to that. My question for you is there, or do you have a fundamental problem or issue with treating economics as more related to an axiomatic system from which you derive true statements, which is more or less independent of how corrupt the data gets? A quick comparison, this may be extreme. In mathematics, we prove Pythagorean's theorem, which is the square of the hypotenuse is the sum of the square of two sides of a right triangle. Now, if someone came to you and said, I found a crystal in nature that seems to violate Pythagorean's theorem, well, no, they didn't. I'll leave it at that.
Well, I was trained at the University of Chicago, and as Ralph will probably remember, it's carved in stone in the University of Chicago, literally carved in stone in the side of one of the buildings. A quote from Lord Kelvin. It's something of a paraphrase, it turns out, but basically he said, if you can't measure it, you don't really have real knowledge. You have to be able to measure. Your knowledge has to be quantifiable. And I think that's a bit extreme, and the Austrian school to some extent was a rebellion against that. I think they went too far. I think many Austrians go too far and reject data and facts, which I don't reject. I don't think facts are irrelevant. What I think are dangerous, what I think is dangerous is this idea that you can use these exotic statistical techniques to parse out, minuscule effects with precision. So in that sense, I'm an Austrian, that I accept some of their critique of aggregation and econometric analysis, but I think they go too far. Then I think they go too far in the other direction, which is to suggest that an axiomatic approach is going to be better. An axiomatic approach can be useful. You can learn something from it, but economics is not like math. Human beings are not like Pythagoras, and they're not like right triangles. And so trying to understand them with the precision of mathematics, I think, is also something of a fool's game. I have a lot of love for the Austrian school. I'm a huge fan of Hayek. Mises wrote many interesting and useful things that I've learned from. But one thing I believe deeply is that economics is much more of an art than a science. It's much more like history than it is like physics or mathematics. And there's nothing wrong with history. The fact that we can't say with precision what caused World War II or what caused the American Civil War doesn't mean it's not useful. But if we pretended to say exactly the weights that were due to, say, social culture and economic self-interest and other things, I think we'd just be fooling ourselves. So I don't want to make either of those mistakes. I think economics is a powerful way to help organize our thinking, but I think trying to ground it in an axiomatic approach can mislead as well, and I'm not that confident. You can follow up if you want.
Quick follow-up is Einstein was criticized shortly after he published the theory of relativity for doing actually a blend. He was
put the microphone closer to you.
Einstein was criticized shortly after he publicized the general theory of relativity. Blend. He was looking at existing empirical evidence and finding existing proposed explanations. And so he defined the idea that maybe time is a little elastic and that time is not the same in different places. And he just came up with this and formalized it into a rather elegant mathematical system. which did not, it explained what was observed so far, but maybe perhaps more importantly, predicted decades later. Now, he happened to be right, and he's also saying that if someone found an exception to his explanation, then the whole thing would crash, and he would be wrong, and he accepted that. The part of the follow-up has to do with, do you believe in
Do I believe what?
in the law of supply and demand?
Okay, so yeah, I believe that when things get more expensive, people do less of them. And that's part of the reason that I believe in that the minimum wage is a bad thing. When you make workers more expensive, the fewer will be hired. I don't think you need any fancy axioms. Most people will accept that idea. What the debate is about is how big that effect is. How much do people respond? What are the magnitudes? There isn't a consensus on that. We can try to measure it, which people do all the time. And they disagree about what the magnitudes are of that response to higher prices or higher wages. But I have no problem arguing that there are truths in economics that are undeniable, and that would be one of them. There are trade-offs in life would be another. These things are basically common sense that most people will agree with. They may not always want to invoke them when they're discussing things, but they tend to accept them. They're also not that useful. We need more than that, of course, to figure out whether the minimum wage is a good thing for all low-skilled workers. Now, let me be an Austrian in the following. Let me be I'm not a utilitarian. I think utilitarianism is a common belief on the part of most economists. So they'll say things like, well, minimum wage may cause some people to lose their jobs, but the gains to the others will outweigh it. And that can be true. That's an empirical question. I don't think we can measure it very precisely, but people will try to measure it. And maybe they're right. Maybe it's true that the gains to the people who get a raise outweigh the losses from the people who lose their jobs. I just find that kind of a repellent kind of morality, the idea that you would boost up the wages of people who are low-skilled, of some low-skilled workers, by throwing others out of work seems kind of disgusting to me. And so I reject that calculus, basically, that kind of calculation. I'm going to come back to Einstein for a minute, though. You know, Einstein made a prediction about how light would be bent by gravity. And there was a famous experiment that tried to measure this during an eclipse, because we could see starlight coming by the sun, and because the sun would be blocked out by the moon, we'd be able to see where it was when it was close to the sun, which we normally wouldn't be able to see because the sun would make it hard to notice that effect. And supposedly the experiment confirmed Einstein's theory, and as you point out, people said if it didn't hold, the whole thing would fall apart. And now, historically, looking back on it, some people have suggested maybe the data really wasn't quite as accurate as the people who did the experiment suggested. And Einstein, when asked, what would you have done if your theory had been falsified? He said, well, I would have rejected the experiment. So the analogy in economics, which is extraordinary, is that in the aftermath of World War II, U.S. government spending fell 60%. 60%. And in 1943, I think it was, Paul Samuelson wrote an article saying at the time he was going to go on to win a Nobel Prize, and he was a huge a top 5 Keynesian economist of his time. He said, if we don't do something, when the war ends, we're going to have the greatest depression in American history. We'd already had the greatest depression in American history in 1933, but he was saying that if we didn't somehow protect the economy from this massive decrease in aggregate demand at the end of the war, when government spending would fall dramatically, there'd be even worse unemployment than 1933 when it hit 25%. Well, we didn't do anything. We didn't cushion the blow. We just got out of the war. The war ended, mercifully, thank God. Government spending on the military fell by 60%, and there was no recession. And you'd think the Keynesians would have said, I guess our model's wrong. But they didn't. No, maybe one or two of them did, but most of them did. Oh, it was pent-up demand. They had a story to tell. So the analogy that I give, which I think is terrifying, you know, if I give you a model that says, if you launch a rocket at such and such a speed and at such an angle with such a set of steering, it's going to circle the moon, and then I'm going to bring it back and it'll land here. Okay? Now, there's a way to test that, because when you actually do it, either the rocket comes back or it doesn't. But if I tell you the stimulus is going to create 2.3 million jobs, Or to take the other side, if I tell you that if Seattle increases its minimum wage to $15, employment's going to fall. And when it doesn't, which it hasn't much at the citywide level, or maybe it's even grown, what's my answer? I'd say, well, the city was growing already. It just didn't add as many jobs as it would have because of the minimum wage at the low skill level. And nobody has to change their mind. There's no real test of the theory. Nobody has to ever concede that they were wrong. You can't even confirm it. You know, the other example I give is if you ask a biologist, we're going to take this forest. It's a really big forest. The national forest, huge, millions of acres. And we're going to chop down 10% of the trees. I want you to predict how many squirrels are going to be at the end of that experience. Say 5 years later. Well, I guess you can make a model of squirrel habitat and how many squirrels there are in that forest. But you can't even measure how many squirrels there are now, probably. So it's just an exercise in intellectual golf. It's just fooling around, masquerading as some scientific experiment. And we do that in economics all the time. Was NAFTA good for the U.S. economy or bad for it? I think it was good for it overall. I think increased trade with Mexico and Canada was good for most Americans. Wasn't good for every American. I think the net impact was probably positive. That doesn't mean it was a good thing, because I do want to worry about how the gains and losses are distributed. But I can't measure that number. Nobody can. And people who pretend to are lying to us. Next question.
Anybody else? Because I've got all sorts of things to talk about. Jim, go ahead.
I want to go back to your 2% number. I want to go back to your 2% affected by the minimum wage. My impression is that a lot of union contracts are tied to the minimum wage, in either directly or indirectly. And my question really is, doesn't a lot of the support for increasing the minimum wage come from union pressure that has no basis in economics, but is politically based?
Well, I actually didn't say that 2% were affected by the minimum wage. I said 2% earn the minimum wage or less. If we 2.5, if we raise the minimum wage, it will not just affect those 2.5. It will affect people above who are currently earning more, because they're going to look more attractive than they did before. It will help increase the demand for their services. And a lot of people have suggested that unions fall in that group in a different way. That unions tend to be higher skilled workers. They're in competition with lower skilled workers. So if we make lower skilled workers artificially more expensive, higher skilled workers will look more attractive, and that'll benefit them. And I think there's some truth to that. The unions certainly are in favor of the minimum wage. I don't think it's solidarity with their low-skilled brethren. Unions have often been used to do all kinds of things that I find unattractive, keep out African-American workers, for example, in the early part of the 20th century. So I don't have any reason to think that they're noble, idealistic people, and that the reason they support the minimum wage is solidarity with their fellow workers. I think they do have an economic incentive. It's certainly good for them, even though none of them earn the minimum wage. They all earn quite a bit more. So I think you're onto something.
Okay. John? This isn't really a question, but one thing factor that you haven't mentioned that I think should be stressed is a common approach when the reality or the facts or the results of the theory or the prediction don't work, and that is to change the definition of what you are measuring. And we see this all the time, a definition of jobs, the definition of inflation. If things don't fit the way they're supposed to be, the very common approach is to change the definition of the factors that you're supposedly measured as a way of explaining away the results.
Absolutely. Totally agree.
Okay, anybody else before I jump in? Mike.
Back to NAFTA for a moment. I thought it was a pretty well understood economic principle that if you reduce friction, cost boundaries, and therefore creating larger markets, that you tend to increase wealth just because, like I said, there's less friction. Is that something that you hold to be true?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's the case that Adam Smith said it in 1776, that the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. If you increase the extent of the market, which is what free trade does, NAFTA is not totally a free trade agreement. Milton Friedman once said he's against NAFTA. I said, why? He said, because it's this thick. Why isn't it one piece of paper that says we won't have any tariffs with Canada and Mexico anymore? And he's right. All these free trade agreements, so-called free trade agreements, are about how the speed at which tariffs will be eliminated, exemptions and exceptions for certain products. And those are all, I think, mistakes. I would much rather just see the one-page agreement. But I think it is true that on average, NAFTA and similar agreements have lowered trade barriers between countries. And that's generally a good thing for the Adam Smith reason that, and your reason is another way of saying it, you reduce friction, you can find different ways to reorganize things that are more productive. So that's a good thing. And that's not the same thing as saying, though, that NAFTA is a good thing itself for all Americans. It probably isn't. If you're a low-skill worker in competition with a Mexican worker implicitly through NAFTA and your factory closes or moves to Mexico, that's unpleasant. It's true you get cheaper goods probably from Mexico as a result of the agreement in Canada. But if you don't have a job, it's not so exciting, those cheap goods. So it's not true that it's good for every American. When I wrote a book called The Choice, which is on trade in general, and I argued that the real reason to support free trade isn't because it makes us rich. The real reason is because it helps future generations, including this one, but certainly future generations, use their skills to be more productive and to fulfill their dreams and to thrive as human beings. And it leads to economic dynamism. That's the real reason that trade's important, not because it makes us rich. It does make us rich, I agree, but that's not a good reason to support it if it ruins thousands of people's lives. My view on NAFTA is that if you lose your job, which is what economic change does all the time, creative destruction, a very powerful force, and technology does that often as well. It's not just trade. If you lose your job, it can be hardship for you, but your children and your children's children will do very well, and you love them, you care about them. So that dynamic economy makes things that bring about creative destruction, makes them worthwhile. Next question.
Anybody else? And it's my turn. Or did somebody have their hands? No. Okay. I'm going to tell an anecdote, and I'm going to ask you to comment on economic education. I actually sat down with an econ student at CU, University of Colorado, and I asked him straight out, do you believe in supply and demand when it comes to minimum wage? And he stared me straight in the face and he said, I believe, and my professors have taught me, that the situation with the minimum wage and supply and demand is more complicated than simple supply and demand. I'd like you to comment on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was at Stanford in the 80s, I had a research assistant, a teaching assistant, who was confusing my students because he told them things that disagreed with what I told them. And I confronted him and I said, we were studying price controls actually. And he said, well, he accepted the criticism that he had been contradicting me. And he said, well, that's because my professors taught me that anything can happen when you put on a price control. And I said, well, let's have a bet. Let's put a $10 price control on, let's put a penny. Well, let's start with 10. Well, let's put a $10 price control on bread. Let's say that all bread has to be at least $10. Do you think there's going to be more people buying bread or fewer people? Or let's put a ceiling on. Nobody can charge more than a nickel for bread. Do you think there's going to be a line for people who want to buy more bread than there is bread available? Or do you think anything can happen? And he was, he wasn't sure. He pushed back a little bit. But, I think it's important to look at places like Venezuela, where people are rioting and waiting in line for bread because the government's controlling the price of bread. we have a lot of empirical evidence. Again, it's not ironclad, it's not perfect, but a lot of empirical evidence that price controls in the United States in the 70s created shortages. They created fewer gallons of gasoline available for sale. So, it's funny. I asked Milton Friedman about some of the progress we'd made. I said, isn't it amazing? When I interviewed him, it was 2006. Gasoline was very expensive. I said, isn't it great that nobody's lobbying for higher for price controls on gasoline? And he said, I said, isn't that a tribute to economic education? And he said, no, it's the fact that most people today were alive in the 1970s and saw that price controls didn't work. When they die off, the demand for price controls can come back, and probably will. And I'm afraid, Ralph, that your story illustrates that beautifully. Next question.
Oh, can you hear me, Russell?
I can.
Okay. I once talked to a researcher, I think it was in the psychology area or sociology, and I asked about this issue of replication you were talking about very early in trying to prove things that had been proved that had been done before, and she seemed to have echoed a widespread bias, which is, why should we replicate? It's really, really expensive, and B, I don't get anything out of it if I do that.
Yep. No, it's a huge problem in all fields, certainly in social science especially, but even in science, that if you replicate something, you can't publish it. If you refute something, you can publish it, but most things you're afraid might not be refutable, in which case you've wasted your time. So better to work on something different, work on something new, work on something that hasn't been looked at before. So that's what's so extraordinary about this psychology project. This came out of a study. I remember the original finding. Somebody did a study where they found that they foolishly tried to replicate their own study, and they found the impact had fallen by 50% that they had measured the first experiment. They thought, that's weird. And then 10 years went by and they did it again. They found it fell another 50%. What they discovered is the relationship. And they thought, well, that's really weird. And I think some psychologists had the honesty to realize that, maybe what we see as measured to be true is just, the result of randomness. And if I do enough experiments, and I convince myself that the one that's the most dramatic or counterintuitive is the right one. And those other ones, I messed up, they're not interesting, I didn't do it right. This is the right one, because that's the one that found the crazy result. It's really bad science, it's sloppy. You should be incredibly skeptical of the things you read in the newspaper where they're quoting a professor about a so-called peer-reviewed study. As Brian Nosek, the psychologist I mentioned earlier, wrote with his co-author in a paper, peer-reviewed and true are not synonyms.
Hallelujah. Okay, another. Well, how much more time do you have, Russell?
I have another 10 minutes.
Okay. I don't want to hog everything. Anybody want to talk? Well, then I'll jump in. A little inside baseball. Could you talk to me about what the current state of Tukey's? There's an economist by the name of Tukey, a statistician by the name of Tukey, who had a great amount of disdain for the kind of complicated economics that was being done at the time. This goes back 40 years. I don't know what has happened since. So could you comment on that?
I don't know his work actually. There are always people who are skeptical. I'll give you right now, most young economists, people who are coming out of graduate school, are totally committed to empirical techniques along the lines I've been criticizing. And they not only believe that these statistical techniques are reliable, they think we don't need theory. We just need to look at the data. We just need to see what the numbers say. And they forget, I think, that the numbers only talk when you put them in a theoretical framework of some kind. The older econometricians are much more skeptical of these things. I've interviewed a bunch of them. You can listen to them on Econ Talk. I've interviewed the people who are enthusiastic and the people who are skeptical. The people who are enthusiastic are younger, and the people who are skeptical tend to be a little bit older. And maybe that's that's interesting in and of itself, of course. But I don't know Tukey's work actually. But there've always been people like me who wondered whether these techniques are as reliable as people claim they are. You have to remember that if they are reliable, you get power. So I think there's a terrible bias built into economics that if you think and claim you can measure stuff and you can work the levers of power with the right calibration, people will flock to your door. No one wants to be told that it's not reliable. So the people out there who are being skeptical, I think it's a tough road to hoe.
I'd like you to comment on what happened at the University of Chicago. It used to be very, I once described it when I was there as libertarianism with equations, and it seems to have gone very far to the left. Am I wrong in my assessment? Or please comment.
Well, I think it's interesting. Economists are more libertarian than most of the professors in other departments at most universities. So you can take an average university. If there are libertarians, they do tend to be in the economics department rather than the other social sciences. But there are plenty of interventionist folks within economics departments for reasons that either because they're right or because they have these social factors that I alluded to a minute ago. Chicago really was a bastion of classical liberalism, libertarianism. When you and I were there in the late 1970s, it had been that way for quite a while. That was the influence of George Stigler, of Milton Friedman. And as they retired or died, the people who replaced them are less ideological. They're, quote, more scientific. They rely on the kind of techniques that the profession respects, which are the techniques we're talking about. And to some extent, the department, like other departments, has moved in that direction. I would say really the only hardcore libertarian economics department left in the country or the world is George Mason. George Mason is really philosophically overwhelmingly libertarian in the economics department, quite a bit of the law school, and it's an incredible outlier. Chicago has become a lot more less heterodox and more homogeneous, more like the rest of the profession. Why that is exactly is not, there's no easy answer, but certainly the passing of people like Milton and others have had an impact.
Anybody else? I'll keep asking, and another 2 or 3 minutes. Please comment on global warming and publication bias.
So I've interviewed, maybe 10, 12 economists, scientists, and others at Econ Talk on this question. I've interviewed people who think we're heading toward catastrophe, people who think there's nothing to worry about, people who think, well, it's going to get warmer, but the costs of doing something about it are not worth it. And I think it's a very difficult issue. It's a little bit like macroeconomics in that a very complex system, you're trying to isolate the impact of one thing, which is the carbon that's emitted by human activity, complicated by very complex feedback loops in the ocean and the atmosphere. And it's pretty clear to me we don't understand it very well. We may understand it enough to be concerned about it, but we clearly don't understand it enough to use it as a bunch of levers and dials again with any precision. And I say that mainly because, the predictions that have made in the past about where we'd be by now are clearly have been wrong. They thought it would be a lot warmer, and it's not. And then they have a story to tell, just like macroeconomics. Oh, well, we had this volcano, we had these ocean trends, this other thing, El Nino. So it's complicated, but that doesn't prove there's no global warming. It doesn't prove that global warming is a disaster. I tend to sympathize with Matt Ridley. I'm a lukewarmer. I think the world's getting slightly warmer, slowly. People say, but it's the hottest year on record. I know, but your model suggested it should be a lot hotter. which suggests that maybe your model's relationship between carbon and global temperatures isn't 100% reliable. So I'm a lukewarmer. I think the world's going to get warmer. I think coping with that through adjustments is probably going to be possible, and I think probably the most cost-effective thing to do by adapting to it, by adjusting to it, by moving somewhat. I don't think it's going to be catastrophic. There's an alternative argument which says, well, it could be catastrophic, in which case you should do something, because much better to be safe than sorry, the so-called precautionary principle. And I'm sympathetic to that idea, but I'm also a little bit worried about the fact that many of the things that people want to put in place would centralize power. And I have a precautionary principle about that too. I don't want a world government. I don't want one government. I don't want power concentrated in the hands of a single set of a locus of power. And so I remain skeptical about the efficacy of dramatic international steps toward reducing carbon emissions, most of which would make many people poor. So I'm a mild skeptic, not about the warming itself, but about the efficacy of doing something dramatic about it. One more question?
One more question. You actually didn't answer mine about the relationship between global warming and publication bias.
Oh, so yeah, sorry. So it's clearly the case that, you know, there are fads and trends in economics and in science. There's groupthink. You know, people come up with goofy ideas like ulcers are caused by bacteria, and they're laughed at, and they're told they're not scientific. They're told, don't you understand, there's a consensus that ulcers are caused by stress and it has nothing to do with bacteria. Somebody comes along and says, gee, it seems to me that Africa and South America look like they kind of fit together. Maybe they were once connected, and those people are mocked and laughed at, but turns out they're right. There's lots and lots of examples. One of my favorites, tragic one, is Semmelweis, who said women are dying in childbirth because the doctors who examine them have come from a morgue and not washed their hands. And he was an unpleasant person, and everybody knew it was ether or something in the air, or windows not being open, or windows being too open. And nobody wanted to admit that they had been the instruments of those tragedies. So there's a lot of bias in science. We shouldn't romanticize it. It's not just economics. There's a lot of things that go on that are are the results of cultural and other issues that aren't related to pure science. And a lot of times the consensus is wrong. That's the essence of science, that the consensus should be questioned and doubted. So the fact that a lot of people publish articles on global warming and human causes of it should give a person pause. A thinking person should take that into account. It is very likely, possibly the case, that human beings are the cause of rising temperatures, but that's not sufficient to make the case for intervention that a lot of people favor, and you should always be skeptical of a consensus.
Okay.
One more question?
One more question, or shall we just give Russell an amazing round of applause? Thank you. Russell, that was absolutely amazing. I want to say thank you for your patience. Thank you for doing all the setup that we needed to do to make sure that this is, well, I hope this is a good recording. And it's going to be put up on YouTube, and I'm going to ask people here to please listen to Econ Talk. I'm going to start doing that, and perhaps having one or two Econ Talks displayed here and talked about in our future lunches. Russell, again, thank you, and it's just great to see you after all these years. You're as cute as you were back then.
Thank you, Ralph. It was a treat to talk to you, and all of those who are listening. I appreciate it. It was fun. Take care.
Take care, Russell. Again.